we're going to think about God's people, Israel. I rarely preach topical sermons on current affairs, but since the events of the past week are so closely related to what the Bible says about history, I feel that we should take the whole of this evening's service to consider this. Now, for a Bible reading, I wanted to read the Bible right through, but time prevents this, and it was a very difficult choice among many passages having bearings on the last week. But there are two that I've chosen, one from the Old Testament, one of the Psalms, number 83, and then the 11th chapter of Paul's letter to the Romans. Psalm 83 might have been a prayer on the lips of Moshe Dayan during the last week. I don't know if they used this psalm in their worship. I imagine they did. But it's a cry from the heart of God's people. O God, do not keep silence. Do not hold thy peace, or be still, O God. For lo, thy enemies are in tumult. Those who hate thee have raised their heads. They lay crafty plans against thy people. They consult together against thy protected ones. They say, come, let us wipe them out as a nation. Let the name of Israel be remembered no more. Yea, they conspire with one accord. Against thee they make a covenant. The tents of Edom and the Ishmaelites, Moab and the Hagrites, Gebal and Ammon and Amalek, Philistia with the inhabitants of Tyre, Assyria also has joined them. They are the strong arm of the children of Lot. Incidentally, if you have an atlas, look up those names and you'll find that all of them are covered by the 11 nations that declared war this week. Do to them as thou didst to Midian, as to Sisera and Jabin at the river Kishon, who were destroyed at Endor, who became dung for the ground. Make their nobles like Oreb and Zeeb, all their princes like Zebah and Zalmunna, who said, let us take possession for ourselves of the pastures of God. O my God, make them like whirling dust, like chaff before the wind. As fire consumes the forest, as the flame sets the mountains ablaze, so do thou pursue them with thy tempest, and terrify them with thy hurricane. Fill their faces with shame, that they may seek thy name, O Lord. Let them be put to shame and dismayed forever. Let them perish in disgrace. Let them know that thou alone, whose name is the Lord, art the most high over all the earth. Now from Romans chapter 11, which I read from a modern translation so that it will come home to you with the freshness of a newspaper. I ask then, has God rejected and deserted his people, the Jews? Oh no, not at all. Remember that I myself am a Jew, a descendant of Abraham, and a member of Benjamin's family. No, God has not discarded his own people, whom he chose from the very beginning. Do you remember what the scriptures say about this? Elijah the prophet was complaining to God about the Jews, telling God how they had killed the prophets and torn down God's altars. Elijah claimed that he was the only one left in all the land who still loved God, and now they were trying to kill him too. Do you remember how God replied? God said, no, you are not the only one left. I have 7,000 others besides you who still love me and have not bowed down to idols. It is the same today. Not all the Jews have turned away from God. There are a few being saved as a result of God's kindness in choosing them, and if it is by God's kindness, then it is not by their being good enough. For in that case, the free gift would no longer be free. It isn't free when it is earned. So this is the situation. Most of the Jews have not found the favor of God they are looking for. A few have, the ones God has picked out, but the eyes of the others have been blinded. This is what our scriptures refer to when they say that God has put them to sleep, shutting their eyes and ears so that they do not understand, what we are talking about when we tell them of Christ, and so it is to this very day. King David spoke of this same thing when he said, "Let their good food and other blessings trap them into thinking all is well between themselves and God. Let these good things boomerang upon them and fall back upon their heads to justly crush them. Let their eyes be dim," he said, "so that they cannot see, and let them walk bent-backed forever with a heavy load." Did God make his Jewish people stumble like this for the purpose of bringing disaster to them? Oh no. His purpose was to make his salvation available to the Gentiles, and then the Jews would be jealous and begin to want God's salvation for themselves. Now, if the whole world became rich as a result of God's offer of salvation when the Jews stumbled over it and turned it down, think how much greater a blessing the world will share in later on when the Jews too come to Christ. As you know, God has appointed me as a special messenger to you Gentiles. I lay great stress on this and remind the Jews about it as often as I can, so that if possible I can make them want what you Gentiles have, and in that way save some of them. And how wonderful it is when they become Christians. When God turned away from them, it meant that he turned to the rest of the world to offer his salvation. And now it is even more wonderful when some of the Jews come to Christ. It is like a dead people coming back to life again. And since Abraham and the prophets are God's people, their children will be too. For if the roots of the tree are holy, the branches will be too. But some of these branches from Abraham's tree, some of the Jews, have been broken off. And you Gentiles who were branches from, we might say, a wild olive tree, were grafted in. So now you too receive the blessing God has promised Abraham and his children, sharing in God's rich nourishment of his own special olive tree. But you must be careful not to brag about being put in to replace the branches that were broken off. Remember that you are important only because you are part of God's tree. You are just a branch, not the root. Well, you may be saying those branches were broken off to make room for me, so I must be pretty good. Watch out. Remember that those branches, the Jews, were broken off because they didn't believe God. And you are there only because you do. Do not be proud. Be humble and grateful and careful. For if God did not spare the branches he put there in the first place, he won't spare you either. See how God is both so kind and so severe. He is very hard on those who disobey, but very good to you if you continue to love and trust him. But if you don't, you too will be cut off. On the other hand, if the Jews leave their unbelief behind them and come back to God, God will graft them back into the tree again. He has the power to do it. For if God was willing to take you, who was so far away from him, being part of a wild olive tree, and graft you into his own good tree, a very unusual thing to do, don't you see that he will be far more ready to put the Jews back again, who were there in the first place? I want you to know about this mystery, dear brothers, so that you will not feel proud and start bragging. Yes, it is true that most of the Jews have set themselves against the gospel now, but this will last only until all of you Gentiles have come to Christ, those of you who will. And then all Israel will be saved. Do you remember what the prophet said about this? There shall come out of Zion a deliverer, and he shall turn the Jews from all ungodliness. At that time I will take away their sins, just as I promised. Now most of the Jews are enemies of the gospel. They hate it. But this has been a benefit to you, for it has resulted in God giving his gifts to you Gentiles. But the Jews are still beloved of God because of his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. For God's gifts and his call can never be withdrawn. He never will go back on his promises. Once you were rebels against God, but when the Jews refused his gifts, God was merciful to you instead. And now the Jews are the rebels, but one day, someday they will share in God's mercy upon you. For God arranged that all be sinners so that he could have mercy upon all alike. Oh, what a wonderful God we have. How great are his wisdom and knowledge and his riches. How impossible it is for us to understand his decisions and his methods. For who among us can know the mind of the Lord? Who knows enough to be his counselor and guide? And who has ever given anything to the Lord first as payment for something in return? For everything comes from God alone. Everything lives by his power, and everything is for his glory. To him be glory evermore. Mighty words those. I want to give you a text for what I want to say tonight, and I apologize in advance for taking a wee bit longer than usual, but this is a very big subject, and I want to give you the broad sweep. I will also be repeating a lot of material that I've given you at one time or another, but tonight I want to fit it all together. Romans chapter 11, verse 29. For God's gifts and his call can never be withdrawn. He will never go back on his promises. And that text refers to his gifts and his call and his promises to the Jews. He can never go back on them, and they can never be withdrawn. I have here a cartoon from the Daily Express. It shows the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aqaba, and on the shores, Nasser and one of his officers sitting in a tank together with other tanks, and the Gulf of Aqaba has divided and dried up right across. And Nasser's officer is saying to him, "It's too risky, President Nasser. Maybe the Israelis are being supported by a force even more powerful than the Americans." Such is at least one newspaper cartoonist's comment on the events of this week. It at least raises the big question in most people's minds I've talked to, and that is this: have the events of the last 7 days been purely natural and political, or have we been seeing God's hand directly displayed in history? Has the arm of the Lord been revealed? That's the big question. It would be possible to explain what has happened in terms of military strength and strategy, but I was most interested to notice that Moses Dayan as his name is, the Minister of Defense of Israel, said in an interview that he personally could not understand how they had done it. It's not usual for victors to express themselves baffled at themselves. And I just want to say in a nutshell that I believe that we have been seeing the arm of the Lord this week. Let me begin this way. The great fact of history, which is the most puzzling enigma of all time, is the fact that Israel has survived. Nobody can explain that. And that's the basic miracle lying behind the events of this week. When every other ancient empire has gone, when Egypt has gone, when Assyria has gone, when Babylon has gone, when Greece has gone, when Rome has gone, when all of the others have gone, here's one name creeping back into the map. Two historians, or rather philosophers of history, set out to find how history worked, what was the pattern in it, and what made it all tick, why empires rise and fall. One of them was the German Hegel, and the other was the Russian Berdyaev. And both of them confessed that they felt they could explain all of history with their philosophy except for one fact which had them both baffled, and that was the survival of Israel as a nation. They said there is no historical reason for that, and they reckoned they could explain everything else, but both admitted this fact to be the complete puzzle. The answer of the Bible is that you can't destroy anything that belongs to God. You may try and destroy this book. You may burn it, you may criticize it, you may laugh at it, you may do everything you wish to it, but that book will be here the last day of history because it's God's book, and you can't destroy God's book. You can try and destroy God's Son and put him on a cross and bury him and seal the stone. But you can't destroy him because it's God's Son. And anything that belongs to God you cannot destroy. You may exterminate thousands of Jews in a gas chamber. You may set out to commit the crime of genocide and wipe a race out of your country's life. But you're touching a people that belong to God. And the Bible explanation is that these are God's people and that they'll be there till the end of history, whatever other empires rise and fall. And therefore the best way to understand current affairs in Israel is to read the Bible and to ask what it says about Israel's past, its present, and its future. Because the Bible not only tells us what has happened, it tells us what is going to happen. And at the risk of enhancing or destroying my reputation as a clairvoyant in the Bucks Advertiser, I will tell you tonight some of the things which I believe the Bible reveals of the future. Let me begin this way. The God of Israel, the people of Israel, and the land of Israel are inseparably united. And that's why I've put that up behind my head tonight. You cannot understand the God of Israel and the people of Israel without the land of Israel, as one man has put it. When Israel is out of that land, she is out of place, and when she is out of place, the world is out of place. And in a very real sense, her destiny is linked to the destiny of the whole world, and the crises of our modern world are related to the internal crises of this nation. Let me therefore begin with what the Bible says about her past, and I just want to give you an overall survey very quickly of the things that happened. By the past, I mean the period until about 100 years ago, through which Israel passed. 3 times she occupied this land, and 3 times she was pushed out of it. Just look at those 3 occupations and those 3 exiles which dovetail together. Occupation number 1 was as many years before Christ as we are after Christ, and it began with one man, a man called Abraham, who was called to leave a place where they had central heating and running water in every room, Ur of the Chaldees, a civilized center, and to live in a tent for the rest of his life at the age of 80, and to journey to this little land the size of Wales. And when he got there, God said, as far as you can see is to be yours. Now, I want to say that the title deeds of this land are in this book. In the argument that's going on just at the moment as to whose land it is, it seems to be no one is asking the right question. It all depends, of course, on how far back you go. Obviously, the Arabs had it before the Jews, but then the Turks had it before the Arabs, and the Romans had it before the Turks. How far back do you go? To the Canaanites? I'll tell you how far back you really should go. You go back to Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It's God's land. And it is for whichever people God decides to give it. That's the answer. It's not the Arabs' land and it's not the Jews' land. It's God's land. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, and God can give his property to anyone he decides. And that's the Christian answer to the argument as to whose land it is. It's God's land. He made it, and he has a perfect right to give the title deeds to anyone. And he has given the title deeds to the Jews. Their title deeds are in this book. Legally, that's where they must be investigated. They are not to be found in the law of men, but in the law of God. And God gave them for an everlasting possession. That's the word. This land. It is theirs. Now, having said that, their title to the land is permanent, but God added that their possession of the land would not be permanent. Their title would stand for all time, but whether they actually possessed it would depend on one thing, their obedience to his will. Their title remained, but they lost it again and again because of their disobedience, and had to regain their title through repentance and a return to the Lord. And that explains why they occupied it and lost it, occupied it and lost it, occupied it and lost it 3 separate times over 4,000 years. The first time they lost it was when the small family of Abraham, which had grown from 1 to 70, disobeyed God by leaving the land to which he'd sent them. He never told them to go to Egypt. There was a famine in this land, and there was plenty of food down in Egypt, and they set off to go. God didn't tell them to go. It was at first of necessity. God had promised to look after them in this land. They went. And they ceased to live in the land for 300 to 400 years. And they became a nation of slaves in Egypt, not then occupied by the Arabs, but by the Egyptians, who vanished, all but the gypsies who roam around in the caravans. And so they went down into Egypt, and they stayed there 300 or 400 years. And they grew from 70 to 600,000 men, to say nothing of the women and children. But they were not a nation. They had no land, they had no money, they had no rights. And above all, it seemed as if nothing could stop them multiplying. Until Pharaoh said, we must kill every male child. We'll have to wipe out these Hebrews. That's when it first started. Anti-Semitism started in Egypt. And Pharaoh tried to kill all the men babies to wipe them out, so that the women would either die childless or assimilate into the Egyptians and marry them. But it didn't work. And God brought them out with a mighty hand away from the Egyptians, and the Egyptians were routed by God. They never quite understood what hit them. And they were brought 40 years through the wilderness, and they were settled back in the land for the second time. They now numbered some 2 million. And they settled in the land for their second time. Moses led them out, Joshua led them in past Jericho. And then they were ruled over by judges and then kings. King Saul, then King David, the best king they ever had. And they never had more territory, more peace, more prosperity than they had under King David. That is why they always look back forever afterwards to the reign of King David as the greatest time they had. But, and here is the point, under King David, they never possessed more than a quarter of the land to which they had the title deeds. And they never have done. In fact, it's far less than a quarter. Under King David, they possessed 12,000 square miles. But God had given them the title deeds to 300,000 square miles, stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates. This they have never had. They had only 12,000 out of 300 in the days of David. With Solomon, the rot set in. And then civil war broke the nation in two. And morally and spiritually it went down, and God begged them to come back to a holy life and be a holy people. God warned them through prophet after prophet that unless they obeyed him, that land they'd lose again. And they did not obey him. The 10 tribes in the north were taken off by Assyria. And then the 2 tribes in the south were taken off into Babylon. And these are the events lying behind our Sunday morning Bible studies in Isaiah. And for the second time they'd lost the land to which they had the title deeds. This time they were not out of it for long. They stayed out of it for about 70 years. And then they came back, or at least 50,000 of them came back, and they began to experience the first problem of Jews who didn't want to come back to their own land. They were too settled in Babylon. They were trading in that trading center and making money, and they wouldn't leave and come back. Do you know that David Ben-Gurion said on the television last week that his greatest disappointment over the state of Israel was that so many Jews had refused to come back to their own land because they were too enmeshed in the trading of the countries in which they were. That happened after Babylon, about 500 years before Christ, or nearly that. But 50,000 came back. And they came back to this land, and they took it over again, and starting from the charred ruins of Jerusalem, they began to build up a little colony again, began to spread out. But the sad thing is that during this, the third occupation of this land, they never had it to themselves. They were under the Persians, then they were under the Egyptians, then they were under the Greeks, and by the time Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, they were under the Romans. Apart from a brief little spell of liberty under the Maccabees and a bloody conflict led by Simon of the Maccabees, they just didn't have this land to themselves. And when Jesus came, he found the people longing to possess the land for themselves and be one nation under their own king. That explains why they wanted to make him king. That explains Palm Sunday. That explains so much of the gospel story. They honestly thought that he was born to be a political king. They were mistaken at that time, but that's another story. The day came when he marched on Jerusalem. Jesus rode in and they said, it's going to happen. He's going to throw the Romans out. And for the final time, he'll give us back that land. But they had mistaken Jesus. They laughed, they shouted, they sang that day, but Jesus cried and wept. Oh, he said, if you only knew. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often would I have gathered thee as a hen gathers her chicks beneath her wings, but ye would not. Oh, if you'd only known the day of your visitation, and he wept for that city. He said, I can see ramparts build up against you. I can see a dreadful siege. I can see the most awful distress and suffering. And he was only looking 40 years into the future. Now, for the third time, they were to be thrown out of that land. The year AD 70, they rebelled against Rome. And Titus, the son of Vespasian, marched with 100,000 disciplined Roman soldiers, and he besieged Jerusalem for 9 months. Women ate their own children to stay alive. And finally the city fell. The Roman emperor had said, don't destroy the temple, but a Roman soldier threw a burning torch in at a window, and the place was razed to the ground. 1,100,000 Jews were crucified, and the forests of Judah were denuded to make crosses. 97,000 survived, and 30,000 of them were taken as slaves to Rome to build the Colosseum, leaving 67,000 still in the land, struggling to keep themselves together. That's not quite the end. In the year 135 AD, they tried a second time to get rid of the Romans. And the Emperor Hadrian, who built the Roman wall up near my hometown of Newcastle, vowed that he would not leave a Jew in Palestine. And he marched through that little country. He only missed one village in the far north, in the hills of Galilee, which we shall probably see next month. One little village he overlooked, and they have stayed Jewish for the last 2,000 years. Apart from that, every single Jew was wiped off that map. And there began their third period of exile from that land in which God blessed them. They are not blessed outside that land. They may be blessed materially, but not spiritually. They're not blessed outside that land. And for 2,000 years we've had this spectacle of a people without a land, and a land without a people. During this third exile, there has been dreadful persecution. Read Deuteronomy 28 if you want to read the history of the Jews for the last 2,000 years. There it says that they would become a butt of jokes. You've heard the one about the Englishman, the Scotsman, and the Jew, haven't you? Of course you have. There are hundreds. It's always the Jew who's the butt. And this was predicted in Deuteronomy 28. It was predicted that they would be isolated, put into pales, ghettos, that pogroms would take place, that they would be despised and destroyed, and that is how it has happened. Let me just tell you of 3 countries that did it. Britain did it. In the year 1020, King Canute, as well as sitting down near Southampton in a vain attempt to push the sea back, did succeed in pushing the Jews out. And King Canute began anti-Semitism in England in the year 1020. The Jews came back for the coronation of Richard of Crusade fame, and they thought it was all over. But at the Westminster Abbey coronation, an outrage was committed that began an appalling slaughter of the Jews in this country, and 500 of them were besieged in York Castle, finally committing suicide under the chief rabbi. And they left the shores of England. Edward I drove out 16,500 Jews from this kingdom. They weren't allowed back until the days of Oliver Cromwell. If you think other nations have been pretty hard on the Jews, Britain's record is nothing to be proud of. In France, in 1306, they banished 100,000 Jews and robbed them of all their possessions. They recalled them 10 years later in 1316 and boiled them alive in cauldrons when they came back. In Germany, the Jews were blamed in 1348 for poisoning the wells and causing the Black Death, the plague that swept through Germany. And they were tortured until they confessed that they did it. And then they were burned or drowned. So it went through this 2,000 years. No people has suffered like this people. And it's nothing new, anti-Semitism. From the days of Egypt under Pharaoh right until today, it has happened in every country where they have been. What is the cause of this hatred of this people? There are many human explanations that they are different, that they manage to color all the money, all sorts of human explanations. But I'll tell you the Bible's explanation. It's very simple. It is first that men hate God, and these are the people of God. That's the first explanation. And the second is that the Jews out of that land are out of the center of God's will, and that leads to suffering, and that they are out of it because of their disobedience. The effect of this persecution has been unusual. It has preserved the Jews instead of destroying them. I'll explain this in a moment, but anti-Semitism has kept the Jews alive. Now you may wonder at my saying that, but do you realize that the Jews as Jews would have vanished and been lost in the sea of history if it were not for anti-Semitism? In this way, God has seen that they had to stay different, that they could never be like other people. And so they have preserved their national survival, if not the individual one. I mentioned a people without a land. By 1960, there were 20 million Jews in 60 countries of the world. That's an amazing figure. It's still less than 1% of the population, but there they were scattered. 3 times daily they prayed for the peace of Jerusalem and its restoration. Every Passover they greeted one another with the phrase, "Next year in Jerusalem." They prayed for this for 2,000 years. If they built a house anywhere else, they didn't finish it deliberately because they weren't staying. Go to Baron Rothschild's house in Hyde Park and you'll notice that the pillar at the end of the portico doesn't reach the roof. It's not finished because he, like every other Jew, was not here to stay. They were exiles and they knew it. A people without a land. On the other hand, the land without the people went to ruin. Under the Arabs it became nothing. Under the Turks it became nothing. And if you had gone to the Holy Land 200 years ago on a pilgrimage, you'd hardly have met a soul. A few Bedouins here and there, a few little villages, less than 500 poverty-stricken Jews. That was the land without the people. God married these two, the people and the land. Neither could be what God meant them to be without the other. The land without the people went to pieces. The people without the land could not fulfill their destiny. And that's the past history. 3 times they went in and 3 times they went out. And the last time they were out for 2,000 years. Now I come to the present position of Israel. And when I say the present, I mean the last 100 years. That's when things have completely reversed. When the Reformation came 350 odd years ago, no more now, 400 years ago, it put the Bible into people's hands. That's one of the greatest things the Reformation did, and I hope we won't forget that in this, the 350th anniversary of the Reformation. Put the Bible in people's hands, and they began to read it. And they began to say, what about the future of the Jews? And it was because people began to read the Bible and began to ask, why did God never keep his promises to Israel? Why have the things he said they would have never come to them? Why has the land to which they have the title deeds never belonged to them in totality? Why did God promise to gather them from the east and the west and the north and south? And yet here they are scattered. Why did God promise them political independence after the exile in Babylon, and they have never had it? Why? And Christians began to read the Bible and ask these questions. May I mention a few leading people who in the last few centuries have come to believe that the Jews must get back to that land. Winston Churchill believed this intensely because Winston Churchill knew his Bible. Lord Palmerston believed this. Lord Shaftesbury believed this. Lord Byron believed this. Lord Balfour believed this. Lloyd George believed this. General Smuts believed this. President Wilson believed this. John Milton in Chalfont St. Giles believed this. Oliver Cromwell believed it. And they all believed it because they believed their Bible. And you will find that all these men wrote in favor of the Jews returning to this land and said, we've got to get them back. And so I could list name after name that read this book. Do you know that one of the Arabs before the United Nations Council Inquiry Committee in 1947 said this: the real thing we're up against are the Sunday schools that have taught this book. Now that was said by an Arab representative. He blamed the Sunday schools for causing the desire to put the Jews back in their own land. Others have blamed the British and Foreign Bible Society for spreading this book. And these are some of the charges that have been made. Now, what is the present position? Let me tell you 5 things that have happened in the last 100 years. Let me tell you first what was the state 100 years ago. I can sum it up in one word: assimilation. By the middle of the 19th century, the Jews were vanishing because they were becoming just like other people. Their religion was dying. From Orthodox Jews, they had become liberal Jews. From liberal Jews, they had become agnostic Jews. Until by mid-19th century, it's estimated that 2/3 of the Jews never went near a synagogue to worship. They were engaged in trade, in commerce, in education, in culture. Their birth rate was falling, and humanly speaking, it looked as if the Jews would vanish 100 years ago. In finance, the Rothschilds were deep in the finance of Europe. You know, I like the story of Nathan Meyer. He was a Jew watching the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. And when he saw that the French were obviously losing, he dashed over to Britain and bought consols on the exchange here. A day later, the news of the defeat of the French came through, and he made a cool 2 million just by being the first to have the news of the Battle of Waterloo. That was how they were in commerce. That's the reputation they have. And they were settled in Western finance. They were settled in education. 70% of the professors in European universities were Jews. They were settled in culture, in art, in music, in politics. They were giving an Israeli to Britain and a Karl Marx to the rest of the world. The Jews were providing people to run the world. And you name any professional calling and you'd find the Jews somewhere near the top of it. And you still will. Who is the greatest philosopher of the 20th century? Isn't Albert Einstein? And the greatest physicist, perhaps, too. Now, the Jews were assimilating. 200,000 of them became Christians during the 19th century. They were becoming just like other people, and it looked as if the old anti-Semitism, the religious persecution, was gone, and that the Jews would settle down where they were, and they'd never even want to go back there. That's how it looked. Until Germany, in the middle of the 19th century, started a new wave of anti-Semitism, not religious, but racial. And until a famous trial took place in France about the middle of the last century, a man called Dreyfus, a Jew, was tried, and it was patently obvious that he was condemned because he was a Jew, not because he was guilty. And sitting in the courtroom that day was a young Jew called Dr. Theodor Herzl. And Theodor Herzl said, "I realize now there will never be security for us outside our own land." He realized that anti-Semitism would never die. And on that day was born in Herzl's mind a vision of Zionism, to get back to Zion. That's when it began. The pogroms of Russia and Eastern Europe, which drove many Jews from Eastern Europe to the West. You walk through the East End of London and look at the names of the Jewish shops, and you'll find most of them East European names. They came here, and they realized that they must begin to look for a land of their own after all these centuries. And it began in 1870, nearly 100 years ago. They bought 600 acres near Jaffa. Baron de Rothschild gave them the money, and they went back. They bought a farm, and they began to teach Jews who'd been moneylenders to till the soil. 1878, 8,000 acres were bought. 1883, another 3,000 acres. 1891, the Jewish Colonization Association. 1897, Dr. Theodor Herzl called together the Zionist Federation in Basel, Switzerland. And Zionism was on the move. They were offered many other lands. They were offered land in South America. They were offered land in Cyprus. They were offered land in Sinai. The British government offered them a huge tract of land in Uganda. But the Jews said, no, 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 no. There is only one land that is ours, and it's this land. And so as they raised money and were able, they bought farms and patches of swamp to drain and reclaim, and they went back. The third thing that has happened in the present, or the fourth rather, first, the assimilation gave way to anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism led to Zionism. And fourth, in the present, do you realize that it is 2 world wars that have sent them back? Take the First World War, 1914 to 1918. What did the First World War do for the Jews? First, it got Jerusalem out of the hands of the Turks. And when Jerusalem fell under General Allenby, whom the Turks thought was the prophet of God because they thought his name was Allah Bey, which means of God the prophet, and Jerusalem fell without a shot being fired, and with the British soldiers adopting the strategy of Jonathan, taking their strategy from the Old Testament, Jerusalem fell under General Allenby, and the Jews rejoiced. And the next thing was that a scientist working in Manchester by name Weizmann invented for the British government a process for making synthetic acetone, which we needed for TNT. We had no natural resources of acetone. And he invented a way of making it from wood pulp. And for his invention, the Prime Minister, Lloyd George, said to Weizmann, "What is your reward to be? You've saved the nation with this invention." And he said, "A home for the Jews in our own land." And on November the 2nd, 1917, Lord Balfour made his famous declaration that the British government approves in principle the re-establishment of Israel in that land. Do you know that on November the 11th, 1918, the very day that hostilities ceased in the First World War, Dr. Weizmann went to have lunch with Lloyd George in number 10 Downing Street. And when he arrived, he found the English Prime Minister reading the book of Psalms and in tears, reading about the Jews, reading about their hopes for Zion. And Weizmann and Lloyd George looked forward together to the day when they'd be back. That's what World War I did. What did World War II do? You know that between 1933 and 1939, a wave of anti-Semitism such as we have never seen in history swept through Central Europe. I was in Jerusalem for the trial of Dr. Adolf Eichmann. What a trial. Accused of murdering 6 million people. You can go to the museum of that dreadful sector of history on Mount Zion today and see the dreadful and grim relics of the cruelties to which they were subject. But what effect did that have? It showed again that they must go. And it pushed thousands of them after the war to press to get back to their own land where they might be safe. The British were in a cleft stick. They'd made promises to the Arabs. We'd made promises to the Jews. And we tried to limit the immigration of the Jews by number and put them into camps in Cyprus. But if you want to read the thrilling story of how that broke down, read the novel Exodus by Leon Uris. That's a book to read, but not at night and not by children. But it's a book about how they broke through that and got back, broke the British blockade to get back to their own shores. Nowhere else did the Jew feel safe. And so vast numbers returned to their own land. And the fifth stage in the present is their independence. There have been many nations that have gained their independence since the war, but there's only one nation that gained its independence without having any land of its own. It didn't have a land, it just had a few farms. But this nation became independent. In 1948, the British mandate ended, the state of Israel was declared, and the Arabs declared war. Syria, Lebanon, Jordan. They declared war then, 1948, and a bitter struggle ensued, which the Jews won, as you know, and the lines were redrawn and patrolled by United Nations. Since then, 2 to 3 million Jews have swept back into that little land. The fertility, the prosperity, the development, there has been nothing like it. And a visit to that land and a glance over at its neighboring countries tells you what development there has been. 48 million trees planted since 1948. It's an astonishing reversal of a land that without its people was desolate. 1956, the fiasco which has been repeated today took place. 1967, under what I believe is provocation by the Arabs, who had their grievance about the Palestinian refugees. It's interesting that the accusation that Britain and America are behind Israel has an element of truth. Not that we sent in armaments, but this is the element of truth. Wherever the Bible has had an influence on a country, that country takes the side of Israel. And the sympathy for Israel is in the Protestant countries of Great Britain and America. And the vast majority of Jews outside Israel today are in Britain and America and are English speaking. There are 4 million Jews in America, 2 million of them in New York State. Somebody has called it the Jewish state of America. And that is the reason why there is this accusation. You cannot but realize when you study this book that the title deeds are the Jews. And that is why the Arabs have made the accusations they have done. And that is why Russia, denying this book and denying the God of Israel and denying the Christian faith we hold, must take an opposite viewpoint. You can see how the nations have lined up. As Nasser said, as the Israeli Prime Minister said, this was a holy war. It was Allah against Jehovah, and they both cried to their gods as Elijah cried to Jehovah and the prophets of Baal to Baal thousands of years ago. It was a holy war, and the world is lined up according to this book in reality, whether they realize it or not. Now comes this week the capture of Old Jerusalem. What a moment. 1900 years they've been outside this city. And now 1900 years after it happened, we had the news. Jerusalem is in Jewish hands. Do you know what Jesus said as he sat on the Mount of Olives just before he died in the last week of his life? Jesus said this: Jerusalem will be trodden down by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. And you and I have lived to see that. What does it all mean? What is the next thing we can expect? Where is it all heading? May I remind you before I close this section of the two strangest things of it all. The first is the religious crisis within Israel and the failure of Judaism as a religion among her own people. One of the shattering discoveries you make when you go to Israel is that they've gone back largely in unbelief. And though they claim that God is with them and though they believe God has helped them, they are not Orthodox Jews. Only a minority are. And they've had all the problems of whether they should apply the Sabbath laws and the marriage laws and the diet laws of the Old Testament to their new state. And they've come up with the answer that they can't do this now. They are left without their own religion. They're back in their land, they're without their religion. Why? The Bible explains that very clearly. It says they would have to go back with a spiritual vacuum in their hearts because God is going to do something new to them. And in the religious crisis in Israel today, we can see the emptiness of Judaism as a faith in all their belief in God as they go back. And the other surprising thing is that the Jews have never in 2,000 years shown so much interest in Jesus Christ as a living person. Sholem Asch, the great Jewish author, has written the life of Jesus, and he told a reporter, Jesus is a living reality. Now think of that. No missionary told him that. That's a Jew writing. Similarly, Max Broder said the same. Albert Einstein said the same. Claude Montefiore, the leader of the liberal Jews in England, has said the same. These people are looking at Jesus as a living person. Apart from missionary work, 40, 50 years ago, they despised Jesus. They might spit at the mention of his name if you did. Now they are interested in Jesus. They've produced a Hebrew New Testament for their schools. Now here we have this extraordinary religious state in the present. Judaism is failing them. Jesus is interesting them. Where is this all leading? Let me come then in the third and final section, and more briefly, to the future of the Jews according to this book. I haven't time to give you all the references. I would just recommend you to read a book such as this book, The Rebirth of the State of Israel by Arthur Cack, mentioned in the Messenger this month. You can get it from our bookstore. That will give you the hundreds of references in the Bible to what I'm going to say. If the Bible is right so far, and bear in mind that every entrance into that land and every exile from it was predicted before it happened, bear in mind that everything I have told you in principle was foretold by God. What has he said about the future? There was a cartoon in the New York Herald when Jerusalem fell during the First World War, and a little boy was saying to an old man, "Now that Jerusalem has fallen, what will happen next?" And the old man said, "Hold on, son, while I get my Bible." Now that's what I want to say about the future of Israel. Hold on while I get my Bible. What does the Bible say? First of all, I believe that we shall see a gradual expansion of Israel until she possesses all to which she has the title deeds. That's the first. God never goes back on his promise, and he's promised them much more than they've got. Do you know that on the news tonight it was stated that the Israelis are saying they now own 4 times the land that was given them in 1948? 4 times in 1 week. I expect to see that expansion continued, not all at once, but step by step. They have the title deeds, and they will get them, not by aggressive warfare, but as we've seen this week, when they have to fight for their lives. Now, the second thing I expect to see, and this is very serious, I expect to see a united invasion of the land of Israel by worldwide armies. It's called in the Bible the time of Jacob's trouble. It means that they will be brought to their worst fighting and worst distress yet, and that they will be invaded from every direction by groups of nations in alliance with one another. A time of such distress and suffering will come as they have not yet experienced, and they will come to the verge of total destruction, but not quite. It didn't happen this time because, quite frankly, it wasn't worldwide forces this time. Worldwide forces withdrew from the ring early on. But one day the worldwide forces will come pressing into that little country which is the corridor of power between 3 continents. And at the very lowest point, when it looks as if Israel will vanish, I believe that God will supernaturally and miraculously intervene to save his people. And he will do so by sending the Lord Jesus back to them. That's as I read the Bible. Christians may disagree on interpretation. I can only give you what I can read there, and what hundreds of those who see a future for Israel read in those pages. God is sending his Son back, and Israel will be saved by his direct intervention at the very lowest ebb in the battle. Furthermore, when Jesus comes to them and they see him, they'll believe in him, and the Jews will be converted. Again and again, prophet after prophet through the Bible predicts the conversion, the spiritual conversion of the Jews. But again and again I notice that when they predict the return to the land and the spiritual conversion, they always predict the return to the land first and the spiritual conversion second. That's why I can see meaning in the spiritual vacuum in Israel today. They will look upon him whom they have pierced, and God will write his law on their hearts, and God will forgive their sins, and God will pour out his Holy Spirit upon them, and he will do a new thing for Israel, a new thing, on the basis of the redemption of Christ. Do you know, it only has to be done, this only has to be done to make a Jew a Christian. A Jew has only to meet Christ to become a Christian. He's got all the rest. He just has to be shown that Christ is the Son of God and alive. When Saul of Tarsus met the risen Jesus, he was converted like that. And when the Jews at the end of history see Jesus, what can they do but accept him as their Savior and their Messiah? And so all Israel will be saved. Now we are seeing the beginning of this. Jesus said that when Jerusalem ceases to be in Gentile hands, These things are beginning, he said, to come to pass. And when you see these things begin to come to pass, look up, for the day of your redemption draws nigh. Jesus' coming is nearer than it was. What then will happen? Let me finish by asking this question. Why ever did God want the Jews? How odd of God to choose the Jews. Why ever did he? What was in his mind when he chose those people? When he made them a nation, when he gave them that land, what was in his mind? The answer is simple from the very first call of Abraham. It's utterly clear. God wanted that people to be the channel of his salvation and his word and his Christ and his revelation to the whole wide world. They were to be priests to everybody else. That was the plan. He chose them that they might spread the good news to the whole world, and that's why he put them at the center of the world, at the meeting place of the 3 continents in which the bulk of humanity lives. He put them there right in the middle. As somebody said, they lived on an international highway. That's why they got run over so often. But they are there on an international highway that from them might spread out the gospel. Can you imagine what blessing it will be to the world when the Jews become Christians? The first ever Christian nation. If Paul says, if their rejection meant blessing to us Gentiles, what will it mean when they're saved? What will happen to the world when the Jews fulfill their eternal destiny and tell the others about God? After all, they gave us the Bible. They gave us Jesus. Jesus was born a Jew, lived a Jew, died a Jew. What will happen when the Jews believe it? And when this whole book is their gift? What will happen? What blessing that will be. They are qualified to tell the world by their geographical position. They are qualified by the fact that 70 different languages are spoken today in Israel. They are a world in miniature. They are qualified to do this by their precarious position in the Middle East, for there can be no explanation for their survival there except in God. They are qualified to demonstrate to the whole human race both the blessing and the curse of God. The blessing of God on obedience and the curse of God on disobedience. May I finish by saying what I said in the messenger. The Jews are God's barometer. Watch it for the forecast. Keep your eyes on the Middle East. That's the center of future politics, and it will remain so and become increasingly so. Watch the signs of the end of the times of the Gentiles. There are many other signs given to us in the Bible. Preaching the gospel to all the nations is one. Unprecedented violence throughout the world is another. Moral decline is a third. World unification is a fourth. But the restoration of the Jews to that land is one among the others. So when these signs come, look up, for the day of your redemption does draw nigh. And remember too that the day when Israel meets Emmanuel, her Christ, is drawing nigh too. I want to finish by reading a poem at the end of this book by a Christian Jew. Listen to it. What mean these groans that fill the air as from a tortured breast? The nations like a moaning sea that cannot be at rest. They are the death throes of a world fast ripening in sin, whose culture is but Babylon, whose glory foul within. But also birth pangs, bringing forth the age so long foretold, when heaven's healing tenderness will this sad earth enfold. Awake, O land of Israel, to beauty, love, and song, out of the dust of long neglect and centuries of wrong, out of the being trodden down in mire by alien feet, out of thy lonely widowhood, awake no more to weep. Behold, thy children come to thee, they long for thine embrace. They come from wanderings to and fro, from exile and disgrace. They come to raise thy broken walls, thy ruins to repair, to change thy barren wilderness into a garden fair. O land, where the Shekinah shone, whose hills by one were tread, writ in the volume of the book, the promised one of God. Rich blessings will from thee proceed to earth's remotest bound, when thy lost sons at home again Emmanuel have found.